There were 14 generations between Father Abraham and King David. 14 more generations between David and the Babylonian exile. And 14 generations later, the great king would be born. A 2,000-year lineage comprised of slaves and kings, heroes and adulterers, prophets and prostitutes. They were the faithful and the faithless. So what kind of king would this be? While many dreamed of the day this king would come, it began as a real-life nightmare for one man. A good man, with God's lot cast upon him.
Joseph. I promise you, Joseph, I am telling you the truth.
I'm not saying you don't believe it. I'm just saying I don't know if I do.
So, what are you saying?
Take her as your wife. Take her as your wife.
She's pregnant! I haven't been with her! The baby's not mine!
Take Mary as your wife.
I can't do this! I don't want to hurt her. But I can't. I'll divorce her.
Joseph, you are a descendant of David. Your ancestors have taken great steps of faith, and now it is time for you to step out. Take Mary as your wife.
But the baby is...
What is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. It is prophecy fulfilled. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel.
Emmanuel.
God with us.
God with us. Emmanuel. Messiah.
A dream, a heavenly visitation, and what was distressing became a blessing. A blessing that would challenge Joseph's faith, demand every ounce of his character, and forever alter the course of his life and yours.
God with us.
What kind of king would this be?
Have you ever had a dream? Are you very good at remembering your dreams? Have you ever forgotten a dream? Well, how would you know? Have you ever had a dream that you simply just couldn't get out of your mind? You couldn't forget? I can remember even dreams from my childhood that you just can't seem to shake. Seems like Joseph's in the Bible, and there are two of them, were dreamers. A favorite son, the Old Testament, Joseph, had a dream, and it got him in trouble with his brothers, but ultimately saved his entire family. And the New Testament, Joseph, got himself, as a result of a dream, into what looked like trouble at first, but ultimately provided an offer to save us all. And the subject of that dream was a son. It would be this Joseph that would receive a call just before the first Christmas to protect not only Mary, who was to be his wife, but also yet to be born Christ child, the son who was the subject, the object of a dream that would be born to this young lady that he was engaged to, and it was going to happen by very unusual means, by the power of the Holy Spirit. And Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25 tell the story of how the angel of the Lord came and gave Joseph this call in a dream one night when he slept. So if you want to turn to Matthew 1, if you haven't already, we're going to look at those verses in just a moment. In Luke, we know that angels also visited Zechariah and Mary and the shepherds in the field, and we'll learn about them next week. But they were all awake when the angels came. In Matthew, though, Joseph is asleep. He encounters this angel in a dream, and this means of communication from God to individuals would appeal to Jewish sensibilities. Remember, Matthew is a Jewish guy writing to Jewish people, and so this is something that could be expected as far as a way for God to be able to communicate to individuals, that an angel would come and speak to somebody in a dream. He did so in the past to their ancestors, and they would often then, these angels, convey to the dreamer what God was having to say to his people at that very moment. And so what this says right at the onset of Matthew's gospel is that the same God that was working with our ancestors, our family in the faith, is now again beginning to work with us. And if you think about Joseph's whole situation and what he learns from this dream, his emotions would naturally have been running pretty high. I mean, as he processed the reality that Mary, his fiancée, was pregnant, his immediate thought would probably be denial or fear, anger, heartbreak, uncertainty, rejection, disappointment, and a host of who knows how many other emotions. And they would have all have been coursing through Joseph's soul as this news came to him, and he would ask logically the question, how? How can this even be real? This is beyond the pale of anything that I have the capacity to be able to understand. But verses 18 and 19 introduce us to this very reality of what God was going to do in the life of this young couple, as we focus a little bit here today on Joseph. So verse 18 says, "This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph." And you remember, to be pledged in first century Jewish culture meant more than just being engaged as we think of engagement today. In the eyes of the law that they lived under, they were legally married. And due to the customs of the day, though, unlike today where engaged couples spend a lot of time together, engaged couples then spent time apart. This would ensure several things. First of all, the chastity of the woman that was to be espoused, or that was espoused to a young man, him being around 18 or 20, her being 12, 13, maybe 14 years old. They spent time apart. This motif actually plays out throughout the New Testament in the words of Jesus and the apostles, as well as they teach us in very varied terms referring to this whole idea of espousal and marriage, in that there's always a waiting period between the time that a proposal is made and the time that the bridegroom comes back for his bride. And so that's pictured here in the very opening verses of the birth narrative, just following the genealogy that Matthew gives that was referenced in the video. This whole idea that this is a whole marriage kind of context in which all of this is happening in, and Joseph is engaged now to this young lady, and they're spending time apart to ensure the chastity that was the expected norm of the day, and also to allow Jesus to go back to his father's house. Now this is really cool. So you can go back and read John 14 if you want, the opening verses, and you'll see this very motif unfold before your eyes as Jesus is sitting down at his Last Supper when he's ready to die. Here it's before his birth, right? The picture is the same. The groom goes back to his father's house and he begins to prepare a lean-to. He adds a wedding suite onto his father's house. Remember, Jesus said, "In my Father's house there are many rooms." Yeah, that's what Jesus is referring to, and that's what's happening here. Joseph would have been engaged to this young lady. They would have spent the time apart to ensure her chastity, but it also would allow Joseph to prepare for marriage, getting the provisions together, but also preparing a wedding suite for their home. So this waiting period was so that they could ultimately prepare for this intimacy that they would be anticipating, but would be withheld from them until their actual wedding night. So it was a very, very beautiful custom of the day that definitely, absence makes the heart grow fond. And so it just totally enhances the whole idea of this wedding and what happens in all of this. And so the expectations are building and growing. As a matter of fact, once a young lady is proposed to and the proposal is accepted, what she would do in that day is she would actually veil herself so that no one else could see her, and that would convey the idea that I belong to someone else. So, eyes and hands off, guys. I belong to another. All of this is going into this picture that we just read over like the Christmas story, like it's no big deal. But this is high anticipation, and so you can begin to understand and appreciate Joseph's emotions concerning this news that is coming to him. What? All of this is just forfeited. What in the world is going on? This is beyond my ability to be able to comprehend. This can't possibly be real. And yet the gospel writer Matthew says, no, this is the reality of it. This is how the Messiah is going to be born. His mother Mary is going to be pledged to this guy named Joseph. But before they came together, verse 18 goes on, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. We'll deal with that in a minute. Because Joseph, her husband, you see it presents him as her husband, because that's the reality of it, was faithful to the law. Some translations say that he was a just man, he was a good man, he was an upright man, he lived according to how God had prescribed. Because he was faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. In other words, he could have gone through a noisy public divorce, which would have further disgraced Mary, but it would have justified him in the sight of his community. But because, and he had to divorce her. He could have done it publicly, or the law also allowed him to divorce her privately, just in the presence of two witnesses. And so Joseph, being a just man, had to go through with the divorce, knowing that she was pregnant. She had violated the marriage contract already, but he had an option then to do it quietly, and so being the kind of guy that he was, that's the option that he chose. After Mary was found to be with child, his eventual desire then was played out right here to protect both her well-being and his own, by the way, well-being. So here he is, a guy with high expectations dashed. He's fearful. He's trying to do the right thing. He's hoping it's the right thing. He comes up with a plan that would both minimize the scrutiny that Mary would undergo, but at the same time, it would protect him. Joseph's desire to keep Mary from public disgrace shows the integrity of his heart. He wanted to protect Mary even now after she had done this, and so because Joseph was this kind of person, in order to prevent Mary from undergoing even more public shame than she probably would already have gone through, he decides to divorce her quietly, knowing that even after he does this, she is still going to have to live through with, look what she did in the eyes of her community and all of the cutting eyes and the sneering whispers. She was ruined. And Joseph chose the most compassionate thing that he knew to do, but still stay true to the law of his God, and that was to divorce her quietly. So you can imagine the emotion that is coursing through Joseph at this time. And a quiet divorce would also work out for Joseph's benefit. It would protect him as well. Because if he'd gone ahead to take Mary to be his wife, it would be an admission of guilt that he too had violated the marriage contract, and that he would be laying claim to the fact that he was this new baby's biological father, which, by the way, he wasn't. And so the only option that he had was to divorce her, and then he chose to do it quietly, and thus a divorce would protect his righteousness under the law. It would say, hey, I'm not guilty. It would also protect his reputation in the community. Hey, it wasn't me. And still, at the same time, allow his compassion to remain intact. All at the same time. So you see the brilliance of Joseph's plan. Everybody can be protected by what I do, even though emotionally, right now, I'm a wreck. And so with all of that running through his mind and this place and plan, Joseph went to bed one night. And that's when God's call came to him, and as he slept, he began to dream. And this is how God's call to him unfolds in verse 20. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. And again, that's tying it back to the Old Testament. Joseph, you're part of this rich heritage that is happening among God's people. You're joining into that history when God is working with his people. And so this angel appears to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David. I mean, this is legal talk, and it ties back to the genealogy that Matthew opens his gospel with, saying where Joseph comes from, and ultimately then where Jesus comes from. And this alerts Joseph to the gravity, the significance of the role that he's going to play. Joseph is a pauper, but yet here the angel calls him. He acknowledges the fact that he is the son of David, the great king of Israel. Joseph is not living like a king, and yet that's how he's known by God and by the angel, because what God is going to do now is something very significant in the life of Joseph. So the angel calls to him and said, don't be afraid to take Mary home as your wife. I mean, he thought he had so much to lose that the only option was to divorce her, but in reality, he was being put in a position where he would be entrusted with not loss, but with what it would mean for the entire world. It would be gain. God was about to give his only son into the protective custody of a young carpenter under all of these suspicious circumstances. But then a little more clarity comes, which really probably only brings a little more confusion to Joseph's mind. Because what is conceived in her, so take her home, don't be afraid, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Verse 21, she will give birth to a son. And so to say that the child is conceived of the Holy Spirit and to be born of a woman named Mary is to disclose this very weighty concept and theological point. His divinity and his humanity are one. This is the mystery of the incarnation. How in the world could God become man? It was far too outside the realm of Joseph's thinking, or anyone else of his day, to think that God could actually become man. But that is exactly the seeds that are being planted in Joseph's mind from this angel that comes to visit him. I mean, he gets the word that God is going to become man. And where in the world do you put that in your theological box? And then he says you're to give him the name, and naming a child would often reveal a calling or a mission. And this mission would be beyond belief. So you're supposed to give him the name, like this child is not your child. As a matter of fact, it's going to be a God child. Never happened before. You mean I'm entering into the history of your people, knowing the way that you've worked with them, but now you're doing something new? Yes, I'm doing something entirely new. And Joseph, it's going to take every ounce of emotional energy and every ounce of faith that you have to believe it. And if that's not enough, this is the name that I want you to give the child. I want you to name this child Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sins. And this is utterly significant. Biblical scholar N.T. Wright notes this: Jewish names are rich with meaning and destiny. Jesus was a popular name for boys in the first century. The name Jesus in Hebrew would be the same as Joshua, or simply Yeshua from the Old Testament. Joshua was an important name in Israelite history. See, Joseph is being tied to all this, and so is this son. So Joshua is an important name in Israelite history because that name reminded the Jewish people of the one who led the Israelites into the promised land after the death of Moses. And remember, Moses was the lawgiver, and the people were living under the law. So this is just incredible. All the law could do, the only power that the law had was to point out people's sins. And now this one who's coming is greater than Moses. As a matter of fact, he's the one that's going to take people into the promised land. And in him, his mission will be to provide a way for people's sins not to be covered over, which is the only allotment in the law that Moses gave, but rather that their sins could actually be once for all forgiven. This is utterly significant. And it's all wrapped up in this whole narrative, and even in the name, which of course is a sermon in and of itself. N.T. Wright goes on to say, as Matthew writes for a primarily Jewish audience, he sees Jesus as the one who now will complete what the law of Moses pointed to, but could not in itself complete. Yeshua, Jesus, will rescue his people, not from slavery in Egypt, but from slavery of sin, death, Satan, and hell, he writes. He will save them from the exile they have suffered, not just in Babylon, which is more recent history for them, but also in their own hearts and lives. He will save them from their exile, their estrangement from God. That is the meaning of the name Jesus. Yeshua. Yahweh saves. And then again, Matthew, as he's writing, I mean, can you imagine the angels telling Joseph this, and all of this is rushing through his mind? Come back down to earth. Matthew writes, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet Isaiah. Again, we'll see all through Matthew that he continually ties this back to the Old Testament and to the prophets in the Old Testament. This is what everything is looking forward to now, Joseph. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet Isaiah. So, this is what God has been doing all along. Verse 23, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. But he's going to do it in a whole new way. God has been working with his people, but now it's just way out there. And they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. This Jesus will also be Emmanuel, God with us. And while Jesus was a popular name in the day, on the contrary, no parent in his right mind would call his child Emmanuel. I mean, who would introduce their kid? Hey, I'd like you to meet little God with us. I mean, no way. To the Jew, God is out there. God is up there. God used to be here, like sometimes. He really hasn't been here for a long time. And now you're saying he's going to be here, like here. permanently here? That's blasphemy, that's what that is. No parent would ever do this. Joseph gets this incredible dream where an angel talks to him and tells all of this. So not only does he have this bride-to-be that is pregnant with a lot of explanation that it's going to have to be forthcoming, but he's also going to name his child Jesus, Yahweh saves, and they're going to call that child God with us, the coming together of God and man in this child. And it's really, really interesting because Matthew knows that throughout the history of his people, that one of the characteristics of the way that God works with his people is to actually show up among his people. And so for him to begin to describe the birth narrative, what we know as the birth narrative, as God coming to be with his people is not unusual. And Matthew knows that his readers will pick up on this theme in order to lay the groundwork so that ultimately they could understand that God is not just coming to visit, God is coming to stay with his people. And this theme is so prevalent all through his gospel. So when you read it, see if you don't pick this up, that from the beginning in the birth, in the infancy narrative or in the birth narratives, you have this idea that God is with us. And then what does Jesus say at the end of the gospel when he's getting ready to go away? Hey, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So even though he leaves, he's going to send someone back, the Spirit of Christ, to indwell us now, to stay with us all the time. So even in the birth narrative, Matthew is laying the groundwork for people to begin to change their thinking about how God is now working with his people. It's the same old way, but yet at the same time, it's new. And the fact that Jesus and Emmanuel are coupled in the Christmas story would, of course, draw people's minds back to this whole idea of Yeshua, Israel's deliverer, taking them across the Jordan into the promised land. This Yeshua, whose name means Yahweh saved, now coupled with this whole idea of God being with them. The thing that would be blowing their mind at this point is that God with them, Yeshua with them, to save them would actually come in the form not of some grand king born in a palace, but rather a baby. And nobody saw that one coming, including Joseph. Wright goes on to note how together Jesus, that's N.T. Wright, the guy I mentioned a minute ago, Wright notes how together Jesus and Emmanuel express the meaning of the story. God is present with his people. God doesn't intervene from a distance, but is always active, sometimes in the most unexpected way. A baby. Who knew? And so a question I suppose that we could pause on today would be, is there a situation that you're going through this Christmas that desperately needs God's intervention, even in an unexpected way? Maybe you need a healing. Maybe there is some provision that you need. Maybe you are in desperate need of forgiveness. And Christmas reminds us, because of this story, that God knows all about your desperation. He knows right where you are, and he's waiting for the opportunity to intervene, even in unexpected ways. Sometimes I think that if God would do it in normal ways, I might question whether or not it was really God. God has this way of not allowing himself to be put in a mold that can't be broken. God is always working, and he does it in the most unexpected ways. And even though we may feel the pressure of desperation in our own circumstance, God has a way to break in and do that. But there's like a flip side to all of that too. When he does it, not only can you not admit that this must be God because it is so unusual, so out of the ordinary, only God can do this, but when he shows up and he does that, because your senses are aware, because your spiritual senses are aware that God is actually doing this because it's so bizarre, he almost always will ask you to do something that's unexpected. You would never plan to have to do things that you would have to do because God shows up to get you out of this situation that creates desperation in your life. And when God shows up, you're so thankful. But then always what follows is what followed Joseph. God sends an angel in a dream to Joseph and says, hey, I'm going to do this outside of the box thing. And so now what I want you to do is I want you to take Mary home to be your wife. And Joseph's like, what? God, do whatever you want, but kind of maybe you really don't need me. Leave me out of this. I just want the blessing. I don't necessarily want what you may be calling me to do. But even when you call out to God in desperation and he shows up on the scene, he always has a backup plan. He shows you his glory, and then he requires you to respond appropriately to that. God takes the initiative, and he expects you to handle the follow-through. Isaiah goes on to say, we mentioned Isaiah 7:14 earlier, he goes on to say in chapter 9 that he would give them a child. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Another messianic prophecy 700 years before the events of Joseph's dream and the things that would follow. God always takes the initiative. And at that moment, Joseph was given the call of Christmas through a dream. An angel conveyed that not only was he to have a son to raise, but also a wife to take home as his own. He was given the responsibility and the call to protect them both, and really to protect the whole thing. This is all part of God's story. And now this young, humble, just, good, compassionate guy is entrusted with all of this. God, I need you to come through. Okay, well, here's a little explanation. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to handle it? Joseph's call was to name the baby Jesus, and he would be our Emmanuel. He would save us, and he would be with us always. I mean, imagine that. What a dream. What a call. So you have to ask, what's Joseph's responsibility? What came next? Verse 24, when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. And so what came right after that was immediate obedience, immediate action. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When God gives a command in heaven, it's done immediately without question. So if you want to understand the phrase, or the two phrases coupled together in the Lord's Prayer, that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, well, this is how it's done. When God speaks, we obey without question. Now, I know sometimes we question, and God welcomes those questions, but look at the place of Joseph and where he is in life, and think of everything that he's facing, and then put yourself in his shoes. How would you respond based on your character? How would I respond based on my character? I would want to run. I would want to fight, and then I would want to run. I'd want to fight with God, and Joseph simply obeys immediately. Not just in his heart, but with action. He ends the engagement. He takes Mary home to be his wife. Verse 25, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son. He was totally out of the picture. Can you imagine that? Mary, if you're already pregnant, we don't have anything to lose. But yet, this was totally God. And Joseph totally recognized that. And so Joseph totally stayed off the scene to allow God to do what God needed to do. And so although this was a very unusual couple, they were also a very ordinary couple as well. They just had an extraordinary call on their lives. Have the Christ child. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, I would think. Most Jewish parents thought they were having the Christ child, but it never really happened, only once. Some Jews today even still think the same thing. Maybe my child will be the Messiah. This was an ordinary couple with an extraordinary call. And by the way, just so you know, and I'm sure that you do, Joseph and Mary didn't remain abstinent after Jesus was born, as some suspect and some espouse. As a matter of fact, the Gospels are clear. He had other brothers and sisters. And even some of them become leaders in the church. Not until after his resurrection, because you can imagine being raised with the Messiah, I mean God. Yeah, there's no competition. Like, he's in a league all by himself. And imagine Joseph and Mary, ordinary parents, trying to figure all this out. How do we deal with the other kids when we got this one that's like perfect here? I mean, the closest they came, the only hope they had was probably when Jesus was 12 years old, right? And they take him to the temple. Very little we know about Joseph. We know that right after Jesus' birth, probably about 40 plus days after Jesus was born, Mary would have gone through her time of cleansing according to the Jewish law, and then they would have taken Jesus to the temple to be dedicated. So we see Joseph in these dream scenes, and then we see him 40 days or so later, and then we see him when Jesus is 12. We don't really know anything about him. And the closest that maybe they could come as being normal parents to God would be they take him to the temple, and they leave thinking that he's with them, and he's not, and he's back in the temple arguing with, debating, confounding the most brilliant minds in the law of their day, and they come back after some long time, and they say, Jesus, what are you doing? We thought you were with us, and they're probably getting ready to scold him, and he says, don't you know I was about my Father's business? Imagine even what that did to Joseph at that moment. They thought they had him. Finally, we get to punish the kid like all the rest, and they'll quit nagging us about it. It's not fair. And yet, we have no record of that ever happening. An ordinary couple called to do something extraordinary, and the character that they exhibit through the gospel narratives, just beyond belief. As a matter of fact, another scholar, D.A. Carson, suggests that throughout Matthew 1 and 2, the pattern of God's sovereign intervention followed by Joseph's response is repeated. While the story is told simply, Joseph's obedience and submission under these circumstances is scarcely less remarkable than Mary's. Mary is credited with honor for her response after she got visited by an angel, right? I'm the Lord's servant. May your word be fulfilled in me. Be it unto me as you've said. Like, I am your servant. Likewise, Joseph should be commended for his immediate obedience when he woke up from his sleep. He could have said, that was a really, really bad dream. Had some gefilte fish last night, just didn't set well with me. But God communicated to him in a way that would actually arouse his faith, tying him to his ancestors in the faith, appealing to his sensibilities about the law, and his desire to be compassionate, which is actually what the law demands as well. And then to go on and to protect this woman and this child who would go on to change the world. I mean, he didn't forget his dream after he awoke. It was unforgettable. It was life-changing, not just for them, but for all mankind, for us all. And yet, at the same time, we don't hardly know anything about Joseph. We know more about Joseph and how he responds to God's call in dreams than the 2 visits that he made to the Jerusalem temple, as a matter of fact. Joseph gets a second call to protect his family 2 years later than when the Magi show up. So again, he's sleeping. Amazingly, Joseph gets this second call. Matthew 2:11 through 15. On coming to the house, that's the Magi, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. I mean, this is king stuff, right? Like, big shots from somewhere else come to your house and they bow down and worship your child. And then if that isn't enough, they opened up their treasures and they presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. All of this is king stuff. Like, this child is a king. Remember, Joseph, son of David, the great king. You're not his dad, but at the same time, this son that's going to be born is a king. And even people outside of my covenant people recognize him as king. So the story is the people that were closest, who should have known, didn't. And even though Matthew is a gospel primarily written to Jews, he opens it up even here to all mankind. The gospel is for everybody. People from somewhere else come and they recognize him. His own people don't, but other people do. That gives us hope. And having been warned in a dream, now another dream sense here, this is with the Magi, right? Not to go back to Herod, this jealous king who was insane. they returned to their country by another route. Verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph. Here's the second dream. In a dream, get up, he said. Take the child with his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Get out of town. Take him to Egypt. Again, rich with history. Verse 14. So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night. Immediately, did you catch that? Herod's going to kill him. Not only is Herod a madman, and he'd certainly do it in the middle of the night, Joseph knew that, but he obeyed again immediately as a result of a dream, and he left for Egypt, verse 15, where they stayed until the death of Herod. So there was a time of exile, there in Egypt. Again, history. And so it was fulfilled that what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I've called my son. So you have the son. Then because of an insane king, you got to take him down to Egypt. Reminder of captivity and deliverance, but also refuge. Take him down there for refuge until I tell you that you can come back. And so what does Joseph do? He wakes up in the middle of the night and immediately, protecting his son, protecting his wife, they move to Egypt. And in doing so, he plays right into God's plan for all mankind to be saved through this person named Jesus. Yahweh saves, who's God with us. Joseph is moving God around. God becomes a refugee. Not with malintent, by the way. And all of this links it to Israel's history and a prophecy from Hosea about an unfaithful people. And it wouldn't be the last time, by the way, that Joseph was visited in a dream by an angel. Matthew 2, beginning in verse 19. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. Now they're returning from Egypt to the promised land. Imagine that. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. Do you know these almost these exact words were spoken to Moses? Not only is this son going to be a king, but there's some tied to Moses as well. As a matter of fact, when we get to the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of Matthew, when Matthew does the Sermon on the Mount, that's the New Testament equivalent of the Old Testament giving of the law from God to Moses. Matthew is laying all this foundation, crazy way. But Joseph and the people who would initially hear the story would pick up on all this. Verse 21, so he got up and he took the child. Again, immediately. So he got up and he took the child and his mother and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, another wacko king, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Verse 23, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth, not even mentioned in the Old Testament. So it was fulfilled what was said through the prophets. And this is not one particular prophet. This is just what the Old Testament is pointing to. And sometimes we see that the New Testament writers refer to the Old Testament as just the prophets. Moses was a prophet, by the way. Go back and read your Old Testament and you'll find that out. Abraham, for that matter, was also a prophet. Go back to your Old Testament and read it and you'll see that that's true. So all of this was fulfilled that was said through the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene, and that absolutely comes out of nowhere, but it essentially means that he is of humble origin. He is a shoot that springs up out of a stump that was cut down, the stump of Jesse. The prophets talk about a shoot that will come up and be the redeemer of God's people. He will be a netzer, a shoot, a Nazarene. In Hebrew, there's a word association. He'll be called a Nazarene, or he'll be called a shoot, a netzer, of humble origin with no claim to fame as a human being. The pattern of Joseph's heeding the call to protect his family, followed by an immediate obedience, is worth noting and practicing, I would say, as I begin to close, in our own lives. So, what is God calling you to this Christmas? And shouldn't you too respond immediately? Is there a habit that needs to be stopped immediately? Is there an addiction that needs to be admitted immediately? Is there a relationship that you've let falter, but needs cultivated immediately? Is there a move that you need to make, and you need to make it immediately? What is it? When we hear the call of God on our lives, may we be the kind of people that respond with obedience, just like Joseph did. Jesus' earthly father. Now imagine the responsibility. And imagine the responsibility of any parent. I mean, Joseph responded immediately. Imagine, if you can, at least to some extent, the impact that Joseph would have had on his son Jesus, God's life. He was entrusted with this incredible responsibility, and yet Joseph went on to learn his father's trade. Apparently they spent time together. And the most amazing thing is, and so you can understand the impact of human beings living right before God, any parent. In this case, it's a father, right? We know it was father and mother. They were upright before the law. Can you imagine the impact that you have? Think of this. Jesus called Joseph the same thing that he called his heavenly Father. Abba, Father. What an immense responsibility. This Christmas, if we're parents, we should be called to that same obedience. And if we're children, definitely the same is true for you too. Jesus was always obedient. And isn't the call for all of us that goes out, for us to be obedient, but not just obedient, beat around the bush for a while with good intent, hoping that it goes away. Immediate response, because it's the immediate response that says the most to those that we influence in our lives. So our call this Christmas is to be obedient to the call that God has placed on our lives. What is he asking us to do? And when he asks us, he desires immediate response, immediate action, because you never know who you're going to affect, how you live your life, approach your work, engage in worship, pray your prayers, and connect with your family has a monumental impact, an imprint, an influence on your kids. The way your kids view you has a tremendous effect on the way that they view God, and the way a person views who God is has everything to do with the way that they relate to God. Did you catch that? The psyche of it all. We are God's representatives on earth. That's what Joseph was. And when God called to him to respond, he did it immediately. So our call this Christmas is, what is God calling you to? And shouldn't you be obedient immediately? It's a call to action, to protect what God has entrusted to us, even if we don't understand it. Our own hearts. The lives that God has placed in our path. Shouldn't we live in such a way that other people who are outside can say, it appears to me that the God you serve has saved you. And as a matter of fact, if I think about it, he's with you. Shouldn't we live such a way that would cause people to think that? And then shouldn't we live such a way as to tell those people, the same God who saved me, who's delivered me, Yeshua, Jesus, is the same God who is with me, can also save you and be with you. How often do we let opportunities go by? How often are we disobedient? At least not obedient immediately. We want to fight with God. Anybody like it when you fight with your kids? Oh, I just love it. No, you hate it, because you know there's a blessing on the other side. And now look, 2,000 years later, stand with me. 2,000 years later, as I close, we're remembering the life of just two ordinary people who responded immediately to the call of God, both of them. And Joseph's call was to protect. So the call to us today is a call to protect what God has given us this Christmas, to reevaluate our lives, to say, Lord, you know, I've been disobedient. I need to work on that. No, I need your help. When you ask me to do something, I need to respond right away, immediately, and let you do your work in me so that I can be a light. I mean, Jesus is the light of the world, and we are to reflect that light. And the way that we do that is to act on God's command. If we receive Jesus, he's in our hearts. And we let him show in our lives. And we let him show out of our lives himself. He shows in our lives. He shows up. And then our responsibility is to let him show out. Not to show off. When they look at us, when people look at us, I shouldn't say they, all of us. When you look at me and I look at you, you know what I should see? Jesus. In somebody else's body. Because that's what we are. And that's our call this Christmas. Will we be obedient this Christmas? Let me pray. God, as we consider these things in our heart, even as Joseph and last week Mary considered what it was that you had said to them and what you'd called them to, God, may we protect that like Joseph did. May we not allow our own stubbornness and our own inability to understand affect the way that we respond to your call in our lives. So today, Lord, we commit to protecting that which you've entrusted to us. The life of your Son, who is now with us, living in our hearts, desiring to live through us so that other people can have the same experience that you've provided us with. So, Lord, may your Son, Jesus, Yeshua, be real this Christmas for each one of us. And may we be reminded that even when we think not, you're with us. And may we always remember to be obedient.